Okay, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for your time to join our today's learning session organized by the Mongolian Evaluation Association. So every Thursday, MEA Mongolian Evaluation Association organizes the weekly learning session, inviting different types of evaluation experts from around the world, especially from the US. So today's session will be a very special learning session. And first, there may be some people who never joined this learning session before. So let me introduce our organization first. Mongolian Evaluation Association has a vision to promote the professionalization and institutionalization of the evaluation at national level, Mongolia. And today's session has three main presenters, speakers. So let me introduce our speakers first. So the main speaker is Dr. Michael Bamberger. So briefly, he has a PhD in sociology from the London School of Economics. And following 10 years of working with NGOs on urban community development in Latin America, he worked for 20 years with the World Bank on various types of sectors, especially gender and development, urban development, and coordinating evaluation capacity development in Africa and Asia. Since retirement from the World Bank, he has consulted on development evaluation with UN agencies and development banks and other different bilateral development agencies and NGOs. So today, he is going to present about an introduction to complexity-focused evaluation with very different types of framework and also with practical questionnaires that we're going to do during our until the next session. And second speaker presenter is Dr. Raymond Gervais, and he has an intensive academic training in MA of University of Birmingham and Master of Social Science at the University of Montreal and PhD degree from the University of Paris, and also as well as postdoctoral research in Paris. So Dr. Raymond Gervais began 35 years of work as consultant in multiple fields as well, for dozens of multilateral and bilateral organizations. So from planning to the monitoring in education, health, and infrastructure, he then developed expertise in evaluation, participating or leading teams mandated to evaluate in a very broad spectrum of sectors and countries. So in recent years, he has moved to volunteer work on humanitarian interventions, such as disasters like floods, earthquake, and epidemic. So today he is going to cover the topic of objective or subjective perspectives on humanitarian interventions evaluation with 3 special case studies. And our final third speaker is Amartuvshin Tserennadmid. She is a lecturer at the National University of Mongolia, and she holds master degree of arts in economics from University of Tsukuba in Japan in 2011, and Bachelor of Science in Statistics and Economics from National University of Mongolia in 1996. And she has a very good grounding survey and research principles through her studies in Mongolia, Indonesia, Japan, Chile, Korea, and the US, and also has a work experience at the National Statistic Office of Mongolia. And she worked in National Statistic Office of Mongolia from 1999 to 2009. So for this, during 10 years of work experience, she was responsible for supervising the household socioeconomic survey and producing poverty report, some very deep and specific levels of survey and research. And today she's going to cover the topic of assessment of the social protection response during the COVID-19 in Mongolia. So also with the case study. So let's start our today's learning session. And we're going to have the our very first speaker lecturer, Dr. Michael Bamberger. And let's share the screen from the Dr. Raymond side. So if you're going to have any questions and comments, feel free to write on the chat section. So I'm going to just direct it to the lecturer.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. Good evening in Mongolia, and good morning for Raymond Gervais and myself. My name is Michael Bamberger, and I'm going to be giving the introduction to complexity and why it is important for development evaluation. So next slide, please. Thank you. This is the outline of the program, so if you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to begin by providing an introduction to complexity-focused evaluation and explaining what it is, explaining why it's important for development. And so I'll then present briefly some of the tools which we'll be using for conducting complexity evaluation. So to begin, just to remind you, could we go back one slide, please? So to begin, just to remind you that Mongolia is a complex society. It's combining modernization with retaining traditional values. You can see here the traditional yurt and the satellite. So this is just captures an idea of the complex transitions which are underway in Mongolia. So next, please. So I'm going to begin by asking the question, how do we define complexity? So next. So urban development is complex. So the evaluation of urban policies, which we'll be focusing on, must also address complexity. So here is a scene of urban Mongolia. So thank you. So next, please. So to think about complexity, we're thinking about understanding programs in a changing world. And so it's useful to begin by focusing on the concept of emergence, the fact that everything we're studying is changing. The programs we're looking at, they're continually evolving. A program in 3 years' time will be quite different from what it is when we begin. The communities where we're working, they change, their attitudes change, their economic situation changes, their experience with the program changes. So again, this is a very, very dynamic. There's political change. Maybe there are some elections after 2 years and you get new local administrators. You may have broader policy changes at the national level. And also the world is changing. There's climate change, there's migration, the international economic situation is changing. So all of the programs we're looking at, they're operating in this complex world of emergence where everything is changing. Next. So it's helpful to think about 4 dimensions of complexity, and this is the framework we will be using. The program itself, which we're looking at, may be fairly simple or it may be quite complex. Also, the organizational dynamics. A large program may have 50 or more different agencies and offices involved, all of which are coordinating. They may have different objectives. They may have different ways that they monitor programs. So even if the program itself is relatively simple, it becomes complex when you have to understand the interactions among all of the different agencies, the financing agencies, the planning, the implementing agencies. Then the third dimension is the context in which the program is being implemented, which we'll see in a moment. And then the processes of change. Programs don't normally just change in a linear way. They move forward, they encounter some problems, they change directions, they experiment with new approaches. So the way in which the change is taking place can also be quite complex. So these are the 4 dimensions we're going to be looking at when we're talking about complexity. So next, please. So this is the complexity map, which we'll be talking about. In the blue circle, there are the 4 dimensions which we've mentioned: the program, the organizational context, the environment in which it operates, and the processes of change. But there are many external factors which are influencing the program: the political context, the economic, the legal, sociocultural, demographic, the international context. All of these factors are influencing how the program operates. So you may have a program which is designed in exactly the same way in a number of different localities, but the outcomes may be quite different because of all of these factors which are interacting. So this is the complexity map which we'll be talking about throughout the seminar. So next, please. So the evaluation of programs operating in the complex world requires what we call a nonlinear complexity responsive evaluation design. That sounds a very long phrase, but in the next slides, we'll see that it's quite easy to understand. But today, most of the evaluations don't use a complexity framework. They have a linear evaluation design, which we'll see. Could we go to the next slide, please? So this is the kind of evaluation which is typically being done most programs today. You have some impacts you're trying to achieve, maybe reducing poverty among low-income groups, maybe reducing violence against women, and you have a series of inputs, income transfers, empowerment training, a whole range of different inputs, and you're thinking that there's a relatively linear relationship between the inputs and the impacts. You can identify how a particular input is affecting a particular impact. There are a number of intervening variables: the education, the economic conditions of the family, their cultural background, the kind of work they have. But so these intervening variables influence the relationship between your inputs and your impacts. But you're thinking that there is a fairly linear relationship, and we'll keep talking about this word linear a lot as we go along. So this is the kind of evaluation which people are using nowadays mainly. Next, please. Unfortunately, the world isn't quite as simple as that. So this is an example of a complex poverty reduction program. You have the same kind of inputs as we had in the linear model: income transfers, job training, providing school transport, nutrition programs. And you're trying to achieve a primary goal, in this case, reduced income poverty, but there are many other outcomes which will be occurring as well: higher women's labor force participation, higher girls' school attendance rates maybe, but also there are unintended outcomes. Increased domestic violence may be a result of, if women's economic conditions are improving, the man might feel jealous, he may feel his position in the household is being threatened. So you can have these unintended outcomes as well. So what we see here is there's no longer a direct relationship between the inputs and the outcomes. There's a series of multiple linkages between each input and each of the outcomes. And so you clearly can't just use the simple linear model. You have to track how all of these different factors are interacting in different contexts. So this is basically the complexity model which we'll be talking about. Multiple factors interacting in multiple ways with multiple intervening variables and multiple outcomes, some which you desired, some which you didn't anticipate, and some of which might be negative. So this is the model we'll be thinking about. So next, please. I won't be discussing these in the first session, but throughout the following sessions, we'll be talking about some of these widely accepted complexity concepts. We'll keep coming back to these, but I'm probably not going to have time to discuss them today. Next, please. So that was just a very brief introduction to what we mean by complexity. So now we'll ask, why is complexity important in development evaluation? Why should we worry about it? So next, please. So there are a number of reasons why a complexity focus in evaluation is important. Firstly, most programs involve some dimensions of complexity. They may be very complex, not quite so complex, but there's always some dimensions of complexity. So if we don't understand the complexity, we're going to misinterpret the impacts of the program. And as we've seen, conventional evaluations don't fully address complexity. So there's a danger they may overestimate the impacts of the program because they're ignoring all of these external factors, the organizational context, which might be limiting or changing the impact. So there's a danger if you use a simple linear model, you might be overestimating program impacts, or you may be underestimating programming impacts as well, because the traditional evaluation models mainly look at one particular outcome. Did you achieve increasing goals, school attendance, for example? Have you improved nutrition? But in fact, there are many different outcomes. So a lot of programs have a number of benefits which are not captured in the simple linear models. So there's a danger you could either be overestimating the impacts or you could be underestimating them. And then a final important point is that all of the sustainable development goals require a complexity focus. If you look at a map of the SDGs, there are interactions among all of the different SDGs. So if you want to assess how effectively you've achieved the education goals or the income goals, the housing goals, you have to look at the interaction between your particular SDG and the other SDGs which are interacting with it. So these are all reasons why it's important to have a complexity focus in your development evaluation. Next, please. So just to summarize that again, the consequences of not addressing complexity in your evaluations: you may be overestimating the project impacts in the real world in which it works. You may be failing to identify many outcomes which are potentially beneficial but not included in the project design. And an important concept for the complexity is called the program boundaries. When you're evaluating a program, you have to understand clearly what is being measured. Are you just looking at the economic outcomes, the social outcomes, the political outcomes? You need to define clearly what are the kind of outcomes you're looking at. And a lot of evaluations don't always do this. Then impacts for whom? Are you just looking at the impacts on the beneficiaries, on their families, on the whole community, all people in that category, for example, all low-income urban families? Or are you looking at the impacts on government policies? Again, you need to define impacts for whom. And finally, the impacts over what period of time? Are you just looking at 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years? Many linear conventional evaluations just look at the impacts over a particular time period, but impacts change. So a program after 6 months may seem to be achieving certain kinds of outcomes. If you go back after 1 year or 5 years, you may find that the outcomes have changed. So again, the trajectory of the changes is not linear. It can go up, it can go down, it can change direction. So defining the boundaries is an important concept in complexity evaluation, which is not always fully addressed in conventional evaluations. So next, please. So now I'd like to introduce you to the complexity checklist, which is a tool which we're going to be using throughout all of the four sessions. And this was developed as a relatively simple, not too technical way of assessing how complex the program is that you're working with. So next. So we should remember that when we're looking at complexity, understanding the organizations is an important element of the complexity analysis. And this is a photograph. All of the photographs are kindly provided by Raymond Gervais. This was a agenda planning meeting. So just to remind us that the organizational context of a program is important. So next. This is just the complexity map again, and the complexity checklist we're going to be discussing is measuring the 4 boxes inside the blue circle that we've been talking about. So next. So the complexity checklist, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, the purpose is to measure the 4 dimensions of complexity: the project, the interactions with stakeholders, the external context, and the processes of change. So the checklist has a set of indicators which rate each dimension. Each indicator can have a low level of complexity. You give it a score of 1, a medium level, maybe a score of 2 or 3, a high level score of 4 or 5. So you're coming up with a set of indicators for measuring each of these 4 dimensions. And the indicators can be summed to produce a score for each of the dimensions. So you can ask, is the project, does it have a high or low level of complexity? The interactions with the other organizations, is that high or low? The external context, does this have a high or low level of complexity? And then you can add all of these together to come up with a total figure for asking, is your program relatively complex? So I'm now going to show you the first page of the checklist. So next, please. You should have, or you will be receiving a handout with this checklist. So this is the first of the 4 dimensions, the project, the nature of the intervention which we're looking at. So you can see in the left-hand column, there are 10 indicators which we're going to use to measure the complexity of the program which we're looking at. The objectives of the program, the nature of the problem being addressed, the size of the program, the stability of the program design, the implementation procedures. Each of these, we have an indicator which estimates how complex that particular indicator is. So, for example, if we were looking at the objectives of the program, if the program has relatively few objectives, and if they're clearly defined, we might rate the complexity as just being 1 or 2. It's relatively low for that indicator. On the other hand, if the program has multiple objectives, if they're broad and not clearly defined, if there isn't agreement among all of the stakeholders on the objectives, we might rate that as 4 or 5. So each of these 10 indicators, you rate how complex they are on this scale of 1 to 5, and then you add up all of those scores. So you come up with a total score for the complexity of the intervention of your project. And there are similar scales for the other 3 dimensions, the organizational context, the external environment, the processes of change. And you will be receiving the handout which has all of these 4 on. So you can see this provides you with a relatively simple way of coming up with a measure of how complex or how simple the program is. So next, please. So we'll be talking a lot about this checklist as we go through the sessions, but basically just to ask, how do you use a checklist? The first way that you use this checklist is it helps all of the stakeholders, the managers, the policymakers, the funding agencies, to understand the dimensions of complexity. Very often, if you hear people talking about complexity of a program, somebody will say, I think this housing program is very complex. And somebody else will say, no, I don't think it's quite so complex. But they don't really have a basis for what do they mean when they say it's complex or that it's not complex. So stakeholders, managers, for example, have found this very helpful to actually put a meaning. When we say that the intervention is quite complex, we can look at all of these different indicators about how the objectives are defined, how the program is designed, how it's implemented. So we have a much firmer basis for talking about what we mean by complexity. Also, this makes it possible to decide if a program is sufficiently complex to justify a complexity responsive evaluation design. A complexity evaluation tends to be more expensive, more time consuming, to require a higher level of technical expertise. So you can't afford to use this in all of your programs. So this is helping you to decide which of your programs are most complex, which of them it might be worthwhile doing the complexity responsive evaluation design. So if an agency has 10 programs underway in that housing field or in the nutrition field, this would help you to decide which 1 or 2 or 3 you might decide to use a complexity evaluation. So that proves to be quite a useful tool. You can also use this tool for the whole of your portfolio. If you have 10 programs, you could do the complexity analysis, the checklist for each of these 10 programs, and to see whether there are general patterns. Do you tend to find that the program itself is, on average, is quite complex or not so complex? What about the organizational relationships? Do they tend to be complex? So you can see whether one project is typical or whether there are different patterns for all the different projects. And another way that this is used is you can compare the complexity score of the program with an assessment of program performance. It's interesting to see whether more complex programs tend to have lower performance assessments, or maybe there's no relationship, or maybe more complex programs have better performance. But that's a useful tool to understand how complexity is affecting the performance of your program. So these some of the ways that we can use the checklist, and we'll be coming back to discuss that throughout the 4 sessions. So next, please. So just to remember, this checklist is still a draft. It's being developed. It needs more work before it can be applied in the field. And also, you have to adapt the checklist to your particular project. So if you're going to use it to assess a housing project, you need to think, what are the indicators which are relevant for assessing the housing project? They would be different from the indicators you'd use for evaluating a health project or an education program. And then to remember, this is an ordinal scale. This is not a high-level statistical analysis. So this is providing you a general impression of the complexity of your program, but you can't use sophisticated statistical analysis. So be careful not to overestimate what you can do with the checklist. It's a useful tool, but it's not designed for rigorous statistical analysis. You can do that later if you need to. Next, please. So to end my the introduction, I'm going to briefly talk about a 5-step model for unpacking and evaluating complex programs. We'll see in a moment what we mean by unpacking, but this is designed as a relatively simple evaluation framework, which you can use without being an expert on complexity theory. And we'll be coming back to this in more detail in the following session. So this is just an introduction. So next, please. So this will be presented in more detail in the following sessions. So for those of you who are interested in more detail, I co-edited a book dealing with complexity in development evaluation, which goes into all of these questions in more detail. So next, please. So this is just a brief summary of the 5-step evaluation, which we'll be discussing in more detail, and I'll be doing a presentation on this in the second session. So the idea of this evaluation framework is that you begin by mapping the complexity of the program you're looking at. You understand why it's complex using the complexity map and other tools, and you're focusing there on the whole program in the environment in which it is operating. And it's very, very difficult to evaluate a whole complex program in its entirety because there are so many different dimensions interacting with each other. So what we do with this framework is we identify some of the main components of the program, and we evaluate each of those separately, and then you'll see we reassemble them to understand what is the overall impact of the program in the environment which it works. So in the next session, I'll be talking about a program for evaluating a program to combat violence against women, domestic violence in El Salvador. And that program had various components. It worked with the police to provide them with computers and other equipment so they could more efficiently process complaints of violence. It had training programs for women leaders to empower them so that they were able to confront violence. It had awareness training programs built into the schools so that the school children would understand more about the violence. It worked with the mass media to get a better coverage of violence in the newspapers, on the television. It also worked with the legislators to try to put in place legislation to combat violence against women. And so for each of these components, a separate evaluation was conducted, assessing the effectiveness of the empowerment training for women, the effectiveness of the technical assistance programs to the police, the effectiveness of the mass media campaigns. So each of these components was evaluated separately using, in step 3, the appropriate evaluation design. And a lot of the evaluation tools you use at this step are the conventional tools which you're very familiar with: surveys, focus groups, analyzing secondary data from different agencies, maybe doing some longitudinal anthropological studies. So you select the tool which is most effective for evaluating each of the individual components. So you come up with an assessment of each of the components of how effective they were. And the key thing about this approach is you don't stop there. Very, very often you just assess the 5 components of your program and you say each of these components has gone fairly well, so the program has been relatively successful. But what we do here, we then go on to step 4, where we ask, within the broad context in which this program is working, the program to combat violence against women, to improve access to housing, to improve education, what has been the effect of this program on the broader issues which it's addressing? Has there been any evidence that violence against women has been reduced as a result of your program? And very often you find the individual components of the program were all quite successful, but when you put them all together, it isn't clear that you've had any impact on the broader issues which you're looking at, the levels of violence against women, the problems of homelessness, the problems of nutrition, of low income. So what we do in step 4 is we look at all of the broader factors which are affecting why the program has or hasn't had an impact at the wider level. It might be that there are some broader factors which the program wasn't able to address. In El Salvador, they had been having a period of more than 10 years of civil war. There was just a very high level of violence and killing, robbery throughout the country. So many people were saying violence against women is important, but we have to forget about that until we've been able to combat the general violence throughout the whole country. So you can have a situation like that where there are broader factors which are limiting the effects of your program, or maybe the different agencies, government agencies, which have to be involved in this program, they don't coordinate very well together. So each individual component of the program might work well, but the agencies are not able to come together to coordinate the broader impact. So in step 4, we're going back to reassemble all of the different components to ask how the program is achieving its broader objectives. And then finally, you can look at the big picture. What contribution has this program made to the objectives such as the Sustainable Development Goals? So these are the 5 steps of the evaluation framework, the complex evaluation framework we'll be talking about. And this is always designed within a theory of change. You have your model of how you think that the program is going to operate, and then you use that to inform how you design the evaluation. So this is our 5-step evaluation framework, which we'll be discussing throughout the seminars. So next, please. So this ends my presentation, and just to remind us that culture, could you go back to the previous slide, please? So that culture is also complex. In Mongolia, you're not just trying to improve the economic conditions of people to build more houses, you're trying to maintain your cultural values, the traditional values of the nomads, of the cattle herders. And so you're trying to ensure that your culture is also transformed at the same time as your economy and your political systems are being transformed. So this is just to remind us that complexity has many different dimensions: economic, political, social, but also cultural. So I'll end my presentation there, and I think we may have a few minutes for questions. I'll pass you back to our moderator. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bamberger. And it was our pleasure to hear a very valuable lesson about the complexity in the evaluation context. So from the listeners and participants, if you have any questions and comments, please feel free to raise, or you can write type on the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and to speak. So what do you think about the presentation? So this this approach that the Dr. Bamberger mentioned are feasible to use, or what's your opinion on the usage of this and applicability to the Mongolian context? So what's your opinion, and is there any questions?
Okay, let me, from a practitioner's point of view, trying to relate to complexity is really related to relationship between managers, senior managers, and the evaluator and the evaluation team. And so from my own experience, being involved in a complexity focused evaluation really depends on the dynamics and really on if senior managers are in fact sensitive to the notion of complexity. And that's why the checklist is so interesting, and obviously the 5 steps, which will be presented in more greater detail in session 2. But from a practitioners and from a practical real world situation, the challenge is really to convince managers to establish consensus on at least a preliminary vision of how complex or not a program or project is. From then on, you can convince them to allocate and to put in their request for proposals, the proper budget, the proper timeline, the proper conditions and parameters to do this type of evaluation. If not, then we still remain in that kind of box of small linear evaluations that Michael was talking about. That, for me, in my experience, has been the greatest challenge of them all.
Yeah, can I come in? So yes, it seems it's very expensive. It requires quite many team members with diverse expertise, not only evaluators, but the other subject matter experts, because we have those factors that impact the outcome. I was wondering that in terms of the timing of this complex evaluation, with like how does it usually, when does it usually come in? Is during the implementation of the project, like let's say formative evaluation, or does it usually come in the end as a summative evaluation, or it can be both?
Well, thank you. I just comment briefly on that. One of the points, just going back to Raymond's comments, is that it's very important with a complexity focus to present it in a way which management can understand, because many experts on complexity, they talk in a very difficult language, using very, very difficult concepts, and management feels very nervous. They don't quite understand what the purpose of this is, and so they feel threatened, so they don't want to get involved with a process which they don't understand. So we're trying with this approach to use quite simple concepts like the complexity checklist. That's talking about concepts which managers understand quite well, and we try to break down the complex evaluation into a series of individual components which are using understandable and familiar evaluation tools. So it's very important that management feels comfortable, that they understand the approach and they don't feel threatened with it. And as Raymond says, it's very important to get them on board so that they understand the process. And on the Jimji's question, ideally, a complexity evaluation takes place throughout the whole of the program. including in the program design as well as in the program evaluation, because the program is constantly changing. And so when we think about this complex of emergence, which we talked about at the beginning, the program is changing all of the time. After 2 years, the program's quite different than it was at the beginning. So you really need to have the evaluation, which is continuing throughout the program life. And it's possible to start the complexity evaluation with a very simple evaluation, just using the tools which we talked about there. So it doesn't have to be too expensive, too difficult to begin. But then once an agency begins to understand the purpose of complexity, why it's a useful thing to think about, you can then gradually bring in more specialists to do more sophisticated kinds of analysis. But you can begin with it quite simple and in a way which people understand and don't feel threatened by it. So it's very important that from the beginning, management feels comfortable with this. They don't feel that they're being left out, that people are talking about concepts which they don't understand. So I think it's very important to be thinking from the manager's point of view, as Raymond was saying. So I'll stop there because we want to keep to our time.
Thank you. Someone from the participants raised a hand, so we are just running out of time. So can you just type on a chat, and maybe I can just direct it after the presentation. Yeah. So our next presenter, Dr. Raymond Gervais, he's gonna complement the Dr. Bamberger's presentation. So now he's gonna present about the importance of a complexity focus for the evaluation of poverty programs in Mongolia. And to add just one more highlight to his background, since 2018, he has invested in mandates with the Global Affairs Canada-funded Mongolia Enhancing Resource Management through Institutional Transformation, known as MERIT program in Mongolia. So now let's give a floor to the Dr. Raymond Gervais.
Okay, in 5 minutes and less, I will try to go through what was underlined in Michael's presentation, the four emergence, what he called emergence, programs change, community changes, political change, and world changes. Let's look at how this comes to relate to Mongolian experience, and through a poverty, because the theme is on poverty, through a poverty mitigation lens, so that we look at what at a global level, and hopefully in following sessions we will look in greater detail, and our colleague Amara will talk about her own assessment of what happened during the pandemic, which comes right after what I'm going to present. What we find in Mongolia is really two, I'm not going to read all of these screens, these is two programs. One, the Child Money Program, which everyone knows. And when we talk about programs changing and evolving, this is a perfect example because it went from a proxy means testing protocol to a near universal distribution strategy of trying to target not all, but a great number of households in Mongolia. So here you have a good example. If you are going to evaluate poverty and poverty mitigating programs in Mongolia, you have to take into account what happened to these programs. One is the CMP, very important. The second one is the funding of the food stamp program. FSP was in fact and is still funded and supported by the Asian Development Program, and it is based on a PMT protocol. And so what happens is that in recent years, there's been a questioning of PMTs, and let's refer to Elizabeth Fox's analysis, a street level analysis of how people relate to the food stamp program at a very micro level, to show that there is a lot of hesitation and a lot of negative perceptions at the street level concerning the use of PMT for the distribution of the food stamp program. Now, in both cases, one, the CMP, because it is sensitive to fluctuations, because it is in fact funded by money coming from mineral sales, it has been subject to the negative impact, and this was clear in 2016, and clearly it was also perceptive, and we're still doing the analysis during the pandemic. So you have here one important, the most important component in the poverty reduction strategy, which is in fact quite sensitive to international context. The food stamp program has come under criticism. Let me quote the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific's perceptions, and I'm quoting: proxy means testings to target benefits to the poor has been questioned for its inaccuracy, administrative burden, and costs. Now, this doesn't mean that it's totally negative. It just means that it is open to some kind of criticism. So the challenge in Mongolia has been to, especially from an evaluation perspective, has been to see that these multiple resources to try to mitigate the effect of poverty has in fact met with problems of harmonization and the effect of the negative effect of the impact on households and the relationship with the global economy. Communities change. Mongolia has gone through enormous changes. The demographic landscape or setting has changed. There's been a rapid decline in fertility. Some of the effects we can see: the poor households, reduction of their numbers, childless households. Important is that you have also an increase of unmarried adults. And again, look at some other studies in Mongolia. The recent homeless assessment shows how fragile singles are to falling into homelessness in such a situation where finally, because this socio-demographic landscape or setting has changed, and therefore some individuals become more subject or victims of homelessness, among other effects. Migration, and especially what's interesting is the creation of a macrocephalic urban model of UB, U being, half of the population of Mongolia. And so that has brought enormous difficulties in and making whatever poverty mitigation programs you want to evaluate, make it very, very difficult, because it does change the context, the national context of these analyses. So, facing and mitigating the impacts of the changing society requires a lot of flexibility from the political administrative structures. And what's interesting in my next point is that Mongolia, from perspective, from a foreigner's perspective, if I was doing a role playing, is brought in as an international expert in evaluation. The challenge which I faced in 2018 is for every administration, for every ministry I've worked with, complaining that there has been enormous turnover, enormous movement in both political and administrative, which is, I think in good part specific to Mongolia, in administrative staff being shoveled around in urban environment, in different ministries and in different AMAGs in different provinces. And therefore that has brought a very fragile administrative structure to be able to support long-term poverty reduction schemes, or even, as Michael said, the SDGs specific to Mongolia. Now, we have to ask our questions, has this had any effect on the effectiveness, but especially, has it had an effect on the efficiency? Is it more costly to implement poverty mitigation schemes when the administration and the administrators and the managers are moving and the administrations are being created or abolished over a very, very small period of time? And then the world changes. What we find, and you just have to listen to some of Trump's speeches, some of our Conservative Party's speeches, we're talking about Canada and the United States, the rise of ultra-liberalism has produced a lot of questioning about poverty mitigation programs. And the question for Mongolia has to be addressed is, has there been any movement towards reducing social protection schemes? Has there been any external pressures from funding agencies, from IFIs, from other funding partners, from other development partners? And what's interesting is that we have a testing example is the pandemic. It really, both in Mongolia and everywhere, has tested what the governments and administration were ready or not to support families that were struck by the pandemic. So what we need and what we see as a rising challenge is the fact that there will be an increase in crisis, whether they're natural, human, pandemics, earthquakes, or economic crisis. And what we need to do is to find, and this is where complexity focused could help, is to try to interrelate the micro perspective, and I again refer to the Fox analysis, to the macro level. And Amara will talk about that in a minute in terms of national policies in Mongolia, and pushing evaluators to contemplate mixed methods to assess the dynamics, both of the households and the national and international decision structures. That's it, folks. Thank you. Amara, do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to push the button? You're unmuted, Amara.
Oh, sorry.
I think she's gonna share it on her screen. So
Okay, here we go. There we go.
Okay, let me share. Can you see the presentation? Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. За сайн байцгаана уу? Өнөөдрийнхаа танилцуулгыг одоо энэ хичээлээр заасан, семинараар заасан сэдвийн хүрээнд нийцүүлээд их богинохон байдлаар гол үр дүнгуудыг хэлэх гэж байгаа. За тэгэхэд ихэнх сонсогчд маань монголчууд байгаа учраас монголоор ярья. Би эндээ ойлголт өгөх нь илүү чухал байхаа гэж бодлоо. Болон тэ чимгээ.
Амрагш.
За тэгэхээр өнөөдрийн давч хэлэх гэж байгаа үнэлгээний тайлан бол Азийн хөгжлийн банкны санхүүжилтээр одоо манай их сургуулийн Энхэн амын сургууль судалгааны төв за тэгээ Oxford Policy Management гэдэг Английн судалгааны компани судлаачид бид нар хамтарч хийсэн байгаа. За энэ үнэлгээ маань 2020 оны 10 дугаар сард болсон үнэлгээ. Тэгэхээр одоо 2-3 жилийн өмнө хэмээг би ярих гэж байгаа шүү. Тэгэхээр тэрийг бас бодолцоорой. За бодлогын хувьд болохоор одоо бид нар одоо энэ бодлого гэдэг дээр юуг авч үзсэн бэ гэхээр цар тахал ковидын үед засгийн газраас хэрэгжүүлсэн нийгмийн хамгааллын бодлогоодыг авч үзсэн. За ерөнхийдөө судалгааны зорилго маань наривчлал судалгаа нь бол хүүхдийн мөнгө хөтөлбөр. За тэгээд хүнсний талаан хөтөлбөртэй холбоотой ийм үр дүнгуудыг наривчлж харах зорилготой байсан. За бид нар энэ удаагийнхаа үнэлгээний судалгаанд бол 2 дахь мэдээллийг secondary data хэрэглэсэн байгаа. За энэ нь болохоор бэлэн одоо байгаа мэдээлэлээр ашигласан. Бусад одоо энэ үнэлгээнд ороогүй бусад зүйлүүдийг бол жишээлбэл яг энэ өөр нийгмийн хамгааллын хөтөлбөрүүдийн үнэлгээтэй холбоотой бусад одоо манай 2 төвийн нийлж хийсэн судалгаанууд дээр бол яг тухайн бодлогынхаа зорилгод нийцүүлсэн primary буюу анхдагч мэдээлэл цуглуулсан тэрүүн дээрээ тоон чанарын судалгааны аргал хэрэглээд анхдагч мэдээлэл цуглуулсан тийм үнэлгээнүүд бол хийгдсэн. Энэ удаа болохоор би одоо 2 дахь мэдээлэл буюу албан ёсны статистикийг ашиглаад тэгээд хийсэн арга зүй маань симуляц байгаа. За тэгэхээр юуг хэрэгэлсэн бэ гэхээр 2018 оны өрхийн нийгмийн эдийн засгийн судалгаа гэдэг энэ болохоор албан ёсны статистикийн мэдээлэл одоо өрхийг төвөрлөж авдаг одоо улсын хэмжээний төлөөлөх чадвар өрхий төвөр судалгаа байгаа. За тэгээд сая энэ хичээл дээр дурдсанчлан их олон dimension байж болно тийм ээ нөгөө бодлого төр чинь болохоор тэгэхээр бид нар болохоор яг энэ 2 дахь мэдээллийг ашиглаж хийсэн үнэлгээ маань эдийн засгийн одоо нөлөөг нь үнэлэгдэх үү. За одоо жишээлбэл энэ цар тахлын үед тухайн өрхүүдэд ямар одоо хүндрэл шок тохиолдох нь тэр нь ихтэй эдийн засгийн dimension-ийн хувьд ямар вэ? Economics-ийн хувьд. За тэгээд энэ цар тахлын нөлөөнөөс одоо ангиж зарч гэдэг юм уу те нөлөөнөөс одоо survive хийх амьд үлдэх гэдэг юм уу те тэрэнд нь одоо энэ засгийн газраас хэрэгжүүлсэн нийгмийн хамгааллын бодлогод тус үзүүлж чадхаар байна уу гэдгийг урьдчилсан байдлаар симуляц хийж одоо үзсэн. За тэгэхээр гол одоо судалгааных нь зорилго гэдэг үл бид нар яах нь гэхээр одоо энэ үнэлгээний зорилго гэвэл ковидын эдийн засгийн нөлөө нь ямар юм одоо ард иргэдэд яаж тусах гэдэг энэ ковид гэдэг одоо пандемик бол за тэгвэл дараагийн 2 дахь зүйл нь болохоор засгийн газрын энэ бодлогонд тэгвэл энэ ард иргэдийн ковидын хүндрэлээс сэргийлэхэд нь одоо ковидоос болж ядуурл өртөхт нь тийм ээ эдийн засгийн одоо импакт аваад ядуурл өртөхт нь ямархуу байдлаар тусдим болохоор байгаа гэдгийг урьдчилж дүгнэх одоо симуляц хийх юм орлого хийсэн гэсэн. За бид нар болохоор 4-р сарын болон 9-р сарын хоорондох 2020 оны 9-р сарын хоорондох ийм үед одоо илүү их фокус тавьсан. Яагаад гэвэл яг энд нөгөө засгийн газар маань 2 багц ковидын эсрэг 2 багц төлөвлөгөөгөө зарласан байсан бодлогоо. За тэр бодлогуудыг үнэлэх зорилгоор энэ 4-р сараас 9-р сарын хооронд болсон үйл явдлыг авч үзсэн. За тэгээд энэ дээр бид нарын хэрэгэлсэн арга зүй болохоор хэсэгчилсэн тэнцвэрчлэлтийн симуляц буюу ерөнхийдөө энгийнээр хэлэхээр бол их богино хугацааны шокыг бид нар авч үзэх боломжтой нөлөөг. За богино хугацаанд одоо ард иргэдэд одоо ямарваа нэгэн пандемик ч юм уу энэс болоод хүндрэл тохиолдлоо гэхэд тэрнтэйгээ одоо тэрнээсээ сэргийх ч юм уу те тэрнийгээ даван туулах юм арга хэмжээнүүд авахд их хугацаа шаарддаг. Богино хугацаанд бид нар яах вэ гэхээр тэдний орлого юм уу эсвэл хэрэглээ нь одоо шууд эрс уналтанд ордгоо гэсэн санаа. Тэгэхээр бид нарын хийсэн симуляц бол одоо энэ богино хугацаанд өрхүүд маань энэ пандемикт митиг янаас болоод ковидаас болоод одоо орлого нь эрс буурна, тэрнээс шалтгаалаад хэрэглээ нь эрс буурна, тэрнээс болоод энэ ядуурл өртөх тийм магадлал өндөрснөө гэсэн тийм зүйлийг харах тийм зүйл байх нь үгүй гэдгийг шинжилэх шаардлагатай байсан. За 2018 оны мэдээллийн баазыг бол суур он болгож авч үзсэн байгаа. За 2018 оны байдлаар өрхийн судалгаанаас харахад бол нийт өрхүүдийн орлогынх нь 70 орчим хувь нь хөдөлмөр эрхлэлтийн орлогоос бүрдэж ирсэн. За тэгээд цаашлбал ерөнхийдөө энэ орлогод бол хот өдөөгийн ялгаа. За тэгээд мөн нийгмийн халамжийн чиглэлээр өрхүүдэд үзүүлдэг одоо засгийн газраас авдаг нийгмийн халамжийн чиглэлээр орлогууд болохоор одоо ядуу болон ядуу бус хүмүүсийн хувьд бол их ялгаатай. За тиймэрхүү дүр зэрэг харагдсан. За бид нарын симуляцигтаа авч үзэж байгаа assumption нь болохоор таамаглууд нь болохоор өмнө тухайн үед хийгдчихсэн одоо ковидын өмнө эсвэл ковидын дараа яг ковидын үеэр хийгдчихсэн их олон судалгаануудын мэдээллийг мөн хоёр дахь мэдээллүүдийг ашигласан байгаа. За тэгэл тэрүүн дээр бол жишээлбэл одоо статистикийн газар Дэлхийн банк Нүүбэс хийсэн судалгаанууд байгаа. Өрхийн орлогод ямар өөрчлөлт гарч ийнэ гэдгийг судалсан олон судалгаанууд байсан. За тэдгээр үр дүнгуудээс бид нар хараад ерөнхийдөө одоо нийт өрхийн хөдөлмөр эрхлэлтийн нийт эрхийн орлогын 70 орчим хувь нь хөдөлмөр эрхлэлтээс хаад тэгвэл тэр хөдөлмөр эрхлэлтийн чинь орлогууд бол иймэрхүү байдлаар буурах юм байна. Хөдөө аж ахуйн секторт бол 40%, за тэгэл бусад секторт бол 20-40%, за тэгэл нийт ажил эрхлэгчдийн 50 орчим хувь нь орлого буурна. Орлого буурж байгаа 50 орчим хүн дотроо орлого нь эргээд 50 орчим хувиар буурна гэдэг гэсэн ийм таамаглуудыг одоо ажиллах хүчний мэдээлэл, тухайн өрхийн ажиллах хүчний мэдээлэл, тухайн өрхийн орлогын мэдээлэл дээр үндэслээд одоо эдгээр таамаглалуудыг дэвшүүлээд тухайн өрхийн орлого буюу хэрэглээг эдгээр таамаглал дээр үндэслүүлээд багасгасан гэсэн. Тэгээ шууд симуляц хийгээд багасгаад тооцчихж байна гэсэн байна. За эхлээд одоо энэ засгийн газраас хэрэгжүүлсэн бодлогуудыг одоо энд харууллаа. Тэгээд мөн өөрхийнхөө судалгааны мэдээлэл дээр одоо хоёр дахь мэдээлэл дээр үндэслээд тэгвэл энэ хөтөлбөрүүдэд хэдийн хэрийн хүмүүс одоо үр ашигын шимийг хүртэх боломжтой байгаа юм бэ гэдгийг харуулад за тэгээд мөнгөн дүн одоо эднэрт зориулж байгаа мөнгөн дүнгийн бас тооцож үзсэн байгаа. Тэгэхээр хамгийн ихний мөрөн дээр бол хүүхдийн мөнгө. За дараагийнх нь тэр SSC гэж байгаа нь болохоор аж ахуйн нэгжийн одоо бизнес эрхлэгчид зориулсан нийгмийн даатгалын хөнгөлөлт. За гурав дахь мөр нь болохоор нийгмийн даатгалын хөнгөлөлт болон татварын хөнгөлөлт ажил хийж байгаа хүн болгонд ийм хөнгөлөлтүүд орж ирсэн. За дараагийнх нь хуваарай хөдөлмөр эрхлэгчдийн нийгмийн даатгалын хөнгөлөлт. За тэр social welfare pension гэдэг нь болохоор нийгмийн халамжийн сангаас одоо тодорхой нөхцөлд тавьж олгодог тийм нийгмийн халамжийн тэтгэмжүүд байдаг. Тэдгээрүүд хүмүүс 100 орчим мянган төгрөгөөр нэмэгдэж өгсөн. За тэгээ мөн хүнсний талаан байгаа. Хүнсний талаан бол одоо 16 мянга те том хүнд 16 мянган төгрөгийн хүнсний талаан сард олгодог байсан бол тэрийг хоёр дахин нэмэгдүүлээд 32 мянга болгосон. За хүүхдийн мөнгөний хувьд бол эхний багцаараа нэг хүүхдэд тэгээс 18 насны нэг хүүхдэд 20 мянга олгодог байсныг 30 мянга болгоод за хоёр дахь багц хөтөлбөр дээрээ бол 30 мянган 100 мянга болгож нэмэгдүүлсэн байсан. За мөн тэр кашмиртай холбоотой юм бол малчтад одоо олгосон засгийн газрын нэг дэмжлэг гэж харж болно. Нөгөө ноолорын татаас маягаар тий багш малчтад олгосон юм мөнгө баха. За эдгээр зүйлүүдийг ингээд хараад үзэхээр ерөнхийдөө манай юм судалгаанд хамрагдсан хүмүүсийн одоо тий 80 орчим хувь нь гэхэд бол хүүхдийн мөнгө хөтөлбөрөөс ямар нэгэн үр ашигын одоо хүртэх боломжтой байхаар ч юм уу тиймэрхүү байдлаар ингэж одоо эдгээр мэдээлэлүүд харагдчихээн. За эндээс мөн хүнсний талаан хөтөлбөрт бол жишээлбэл нийт хүн амын 8.1% нь ямар ч байсан хамрагдах юм байна гэдэг тийм тоо мэдээллүүдийг тооцож гаргасан. За эдгээрийн төсөв нийт дүн нь болохоор 2018 оны дотоодын нэмэгдээний 5.3%-тай тэнцэхээр за тэгээ нийт мөнгөн дүн болохоор засгийн газраас одоо зарласан мөнгөн дүнтэй ойролцоо ийм тооцоололтой гарсан байсан. За тэгэхээр бид нарын нөгөө хийж байгаа тооцоолол бол assumption тавиад хийж байгаа симуляц маань ямар ч байсан тийм хутлаа биштэй хазаалт багтай тооцоо гарах боломжтой юм а гэдгийг ингээд шалгачиж байгаа гэсэн. За тэгээд дараагийн нэг хийсэн тооцоо бол тэгвэл энэ тооцоолууд маань яг хүн амын бүлгүүдийг одоо ядуугаас нь баянд гэдэг 5 квинтал хуваагаад үзэхээр одоо энэ нэг засгийн газраас зарласан хөтөлбөр тус болгоно тий дээд одоо мөрийн толгойд бичсэн байгаа хөтөлбөр тус болгоно нь тэгвэл энэ баян ядуу хүмүүст яаж хуваарлагдаж очихоор байгаа юм бэ гэдгийг бас мөн симуляц хийж харсан. За тэгэхээр хамгийн одоо сүүлийн баган дээр байгаа хүнсний талаан food stamp гэлтэхэд тийм ээ энэ бол одоо хамгийн ядуу 20% квинталын хамгийн доод хэсэгт байгаа 20% нь бол энэ хүнсний талааны зарцуулж байгаа мөнгөнд дүнгийн 62% ч юм очих юм байна гэсэн байдлаар. За тэгвэл одоо хамгийн ихний баганд байгаа ажиллагчдын нийгмийн даатгал татварын хөнгөлөлт бол одоо илүү их те чимээлэг хэсэгт илүү их төвлөр тэднэрт илүү их одоо хөнгөлт beneficiary те үр өгөөж үзүүлэх юм байна гэсэн байдлаар гарсан байна. За тэгэхээр дараагийн нэг хийсэн тооцоо нь болохоор тэгвэл бид нар энэ пандемикийн үеийн хүмүүсийн хэрэглээг одоо яаж өөрчлөгдөх вэ гэдэг дээр тооцоонууд хийсэн байгаа. Одоо энэ улаан өнгөтэй нь бол одоо бид нар ийм цар тахлын нөлөөлнөөс болоод богино хугацаанд өрхөдийн орлого хэрэглээ нь шууд буурчлаа. Яагаад гэвэл хөдөлмөр эрхлэлтийн бусад орлогууд нь буурна гэсэн таамаглал төр үндэслээд. Тэгэхээр бол ерөнхийдөө энэ хамгийн бага пүүрсдгээтэй энэ графикийн зүүн хэсэгт байгаа, зүүн гар хэсэгт байгаа зүйл дээр бол тэгээд дроп бол уналт бол маш ихээр харагдах байдалтай харагдчихсэн. Одоо дээдлийн лайнуудад болохоор хэрвээ бид нар энэ хөтөлбөрүүдийг хэрвээ дангаар нь хөтөлбөрүүдийн хэрэгжүүлэлтийг дангаар хэрэгжүүлсэн үед гарах үр дүнгуудийнх нь одоо нөлөө хэрэглээнд ямар нөлөө үзүүлж байна гэхээр энэ графикийн одоо дээдлийн лайнууд болохоор арай өндөр илүү хэрэглээтэй одоо амжираа дээшлж байгааг харуулж байгаа гэсэн. Тэгэхээр ерөнхийдөө одоо ингээл одоо энэ улааны дээдлэлт байгаа хар зураас гэлдэг чинь те ерөнхийдөө хүн ам дээр юм тэнцүү байдалтай те илүү жоохон баян хэсгийнх нь хэрэглээг жоохон нэмэгдүүлэх байдалтай дээр харагдаж байна. За тэр одоо хүнсний хүүхдийн мөнгө те хүүхдийн мөнгө одоо энэ цэнхэр зураас харагдах бол хүүхдийн мөнгөний хөтөлбөрийн одоо нөлөө нь болохоор илүү одоо ядуу хэсэгт нь илүү их тэдний хэрэглээг илүү их дээшлүүлэх амжиргааг нь илүү их дэмжсэн байдалтайгаар ийм гарч ирэх юм агталтай. За ингээд нийтдээ энэ бүх бодлогод болохоор ерөнхийдөө бүх одоо хэрэглээний бүх бүлгүүдийн хэрэглээг бол энэ улаан шугамнаас бол эрс дэше гаргаж ирж байна. Гэхдээ болол ер нь бол хамгийн одоо пүүрист хэсгтээ те илүү их нөлөөг авчирхаар байна. Эдгээрийн зөрүүг гэж харахад чинь бараг те 3-6 орчим пунктээр ингэж өөрчлөгдөх ийм зөрүүнүүд гарсан байна. За тэгээд гол зүйлээ бид нар бас нөгөө ядуурл бид нар маань яаж нөлөөлөх юм болоо гэж таамаглаж үзсэн. За тэгээд 2018 онд бол нөгөө бейслайн буюу ядуурлын head count ratio маань 28.4 буюу одоо пандемик болохоос өмнө бол 28.4-тэй байгаа юм байна. Тэгээ 28.4% нь ядуу байгаа юм байна нийт хүн. За тэгвэл одоо энэ зар даглалын өөр нөлөөгөөр цар тахлын одоо нөлөөгөөр нийт хүн амын 36.7% нь ядуу болох магадлалтай. Одоо орлого буураад хэрэглээ бурчиж байгаа учраас. Гэхдээ энэ богино хугацаанд авсан шинжилгээ гэдгийг бас анхаарна тийм ээ. За тэгвэл хэрвээ бид нарыг одоо энэ зөвхөн одоо тэр даатгал татвар дээр хөнгөлөлт үзүүлээд хэлвэл тэгвэл энэ ядуурл 36% хүрэх байсан ядуурл маань 30 орчим болж буурах юм байна. За одоо хүүхдийн мөнгөний хадгалан хүүхдийн мөнгийг өрхүүдэд нэмэгдсэн байдлаар алгаж эхлэнээс те 20,000 байжгаад хүүхд бүр 100,000 болгоод эхлэнээс шалтгаалаад 36% хүрэх байсан ядуурл маань 24% болж буурах юм байна гэсэн байдалтай. За тэгээ бүх энэ одоо төрийн засгийн газраас хэрэгжүүлсэн 6 арга хэмжээг нийтд нь аваад үзвэл ядуурл ер нь бол 17 орчим хувьд хүрэх боломжтой шүү. За цар тахлын үед бол нөлөө хэрвээ ийм арга хэмжээнүүд аваад бол 36% хүрэх байсан. Тэгэхээр ямар ч гэсэн цар одоо энэ нөлөөнүүд бол энэ ядуурлын head count ratio бол маш их хүчтэй нөлөө үзүүлэхээр байна гэсэн прогноз хийж ирсэн байна. За тэгээ мөн ядуурлыг хүн амын бүлгүүдээр одоо хараад үзвэл хамгийн их ядуурлд өртөх хүмүүс бол энэ 4-өөс дээш хүүхэдтэй өрхүүд байсан. За одоо нэг пандемикийн нөлөөгөөр бол бараг 57 орчим тий 10 одоо хүний 6 орчим одоо 6 ядуурлд өртчих тийм байдалтай байсан байх нь шүү дээ. За тэгэхээр эдгээр одоо өрхүүд маань одоо энэ цэнхэр дээр очсон тийм ээ. Одоо энэс шалтгаалаад ядуурлууд нь бол бараг даблахаар тийм буурахаар одоо төвшөнд хүрсэн шинжилгээний хувьд харагдаж байна. За одоо эдгээр зүйлүүдийг ерөнхийд нь ингээд дүгнээд хэлэхээр бид нар бол одоо сөрөг нөлөөг юм пандемикийн сөрөг нөлөөг багасгах боломж зүйлийн засгийн газрын бодлогот байгаа мó аль хэсгээр нь илүү их сөрөг нөлөөг буулгах юм бэ гэдгийг харах зорилготой хийсэн байгаа. За тэгэхээр мэдээж энэ бодлогод бол пандемикийн нөлөөг бол багасгаж байна. За тэгээд мөн дахин хуваарлтын бодлого талаас, орлогын дахин хуваарлах талаас бол энэ хөтөлбөрүүд бол их боломжтой хэрэгцсэн хөтөлбөрүүд. Энэ нь болохоор нэг хүүхдийн мөнгөөр харагдаж байна, хүнсний талаанаар харагдаж байна. Тэгээ хүнсний талаан бол жишээлбэл хамгийн ядуу хэсгийн амжиргааг бол дээшлүүлэхэд их хувь нэмэр үзүүлэхээр байна. Хүүхдийн мөнгө бас хувь нэмэр үзүүлэхээр байна. Яагаад гэвэл хүүхдийн мөнгө нөө ядуу өрхөд их олон хүүхдтэй байдаг гэдэг хандлагатай байдаг учраас. За тэгэхээр ерөнхийдөө энэ бодлогод маань одоо Монгол улсын тэгш бас байдал одоо их хурцтахад бол илүү нөлөө үзүүлээд арай тэрийг багасгасан байна гэсэн тийм үр дүнтэй гарсан. За надад цаг үлдсэн үү зэрмаа?
ерөнхийдөө цаг нь болцсон байна.
Зүгээр нөгөө ганцхан минутаар хэлчихье. Одоо тэгээд нөгөө бид нар бол нөгөө эдийн засгийн шокын яг ингээд зөвхөн 2 дахь мэдээлэл ашиглаад симуляц хийгээд ийм нэг эдийн засгийн арга зүгээр тооцоод байгаа шүү дээ. Одоо бас энэ төслийнхаа хүрээнд хүнсний одоо талаан тамрагдж байгаа хүмүүс ажил эрхлэлтийнх нь хамаарал ямар байна гэж одоо нөгөө бодлого боловсруулагчдын чинь дундчил тэгээд бас хүнсний талаа аваад ажил хийх хэрэгтэй байна гэдэг. Тэгээд тэр нь яг үнэн юм уу гэсэн бас судалгаанууд дээр анх дахь мэдээлэл ашиглаад юм 2 дахь мэдээлэл за тэгээд захиргааны статистик мэдээлэлүүд ингээд 4-5 мэдээллийн их усрыг ашиглаад одоо нэг бодлогыг үнэлэхэд олон мэдээллийн их уср шаардлагатай гэдгээр олон мэдээлэл ашиглаад хийсэн судалгааны үр дүнүүдс гарсан байгаа. Тэгээд ер нь хүнсний талаа маань хүнийг ажилгүй байлгаад байдаг тийм зүйл ба гэдэг дээр бол тийм нотлох баримт гараагүй. Тэгээд тэрний бас үр дүн бол бид судалгааны тайлбарууд бол гарсан байгаа. За баярлалаа.
Thank you so much for both of the presentations, Dr. Raymond and Ms. Amartuvshin. So it was a very interesting survey and research, and also case study celebrating the Mongolian case. So now it's time to move on to the next session, which is question and discussion on the seminars. So from the participants, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. So there is one question on the chat, so I'm gonna just read it now. So it's for the Dr. Bamberger from Wolfgang. So she's asking, so is complexity evaluation similar to impact evaluation? What kind of learning would you derive from dealing with complexities? Dr. Bamberger, can you elaborate on this question?
Yes. Firstly, thank you to my colleagues for very interesting, very helpful presentations. On this question of the relationship between impact evaluation and complexity evaluation, as we saw with the 5-step model, the steps 2 and 3 are using conventional approaches to impact evaluation, that we break the program down into different components, and we use quite familiar tools for assessing the impacts of the different components. So step 3 is, until then, you're following a fairly conventional approach to impact evaluation. The big difference is we have the steps 4 and 5, where we look at the effects of the program within the broader context, that each of the individual components might have been achieving some impacts, but when we look at it within the economic, political, socio-cultural, all of the factors that Raymond was talking about, we may find that the effects can be significantly reduced because the international economy, for example, might limit the possibilities of generating income. So we begin with the traditional impact evaluations, but we go on to look at how this operates within the broader context. So as we saw, you can have a program where the impacts seem to be fairly positive, but when you look at the organizational, the economic, political, other external factors, this might reduce quite significantly the impact. So the whole purpose of this approach is to try to use conventional evaluation tools as much as possible. So we try to start off using conventional tools, and then we go beyond that to try and look at the broader context.
Thank you, Dr. Bamberger, for the answer. And is there any other additional question from the participants?
Yes, there is one question in the chat from Degi.
Yeah. Okay, so Dilhir asked that, how difficult is it to ensure the participation of stakeholders in the mapping of complexity dimensions and to integrate the information of the parties? So is it for, I think, Dr. Bamberger?
Maybe Raymond would like to comment on that, of thinking about the Mongolian context. It's a very important question, and I'd be happy to comment, but I think it would be good to begin by thinking about how this would work in the Mongolian context of bringing together all of the different stakeholders, which is always quite challenging, both the national and the international stakeholders. So Raymond, would you like to comment on how that would seem from the Mongolian context?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Degi, for the question. Let's rather than process it theoretically, let's look at an example, a Mongolian example. The National Statistical Office and the World Bank wrote a report on the decade of poverty reduction policies from a macroeconomic perspective. Okay, what comes out of the report, and this is where it addresses Degi's question, what comes out of the report is that from a practitioner, from an evaluation practitioner perspective, challenges, incredible challenges that are related to the notion of complexity. First of all, there's a question of data. The report itself questions that the trend line has been cut by a change of methodology, which may explain what both the World Bank and the Statistical Office discovered and could not understand, is why income was increasing, but consumption was not increasing, especially among the lowest quintiles in Mongolian population. Okay, now, from that perspective, if you're an evaluator, you have to go and adopt a mixed method approach, simply because a possible answer, if you set aside and explain and try to find an explanation of what the impact of a change in methodology was, and go back to the notion of why would there be an increase in income and no increase in consumption, you have to then adopt an approach where stakeholders, all stakeholders, are in fact invited to give elements of explanations. And what's interesting is that if we are dealing with stakeholders that very often in evaluations are invisible, the poorest, the most marginalized, the only logical answer really comes from them. First, because they were submitted indirectly to the impacts of the 2016 crisis. And then, as the report says, at the outset of the pandemic, they were also involved in whatever support the government was ready to give them. So you have a situation where stakeholders like the World Bank, stakeholders like, the national, the political structures in Mongolia are able to give some kind of feedback on how they see poverty mitigation strategies developing. though they don't have an explanation of why there is that dichotomy between, incomes going up and consumption not going up. The answer, in fact, may, and this is what comes out of Fox's analysis, the answer may come from the fact that the poorest portions of the population, the ones that are, in fact, the potential beneficiaries of these schemes, are trying to deal, and that the notion that comes to my mind as an evaluator, and that really changes according to the national, specific context. The notion of survival strategy becomes an element of answer to the question why there is that dichotomy. So if I was to answer Dege's question, that's how stakeholders are called and can be and should be, in fact, involved in coming up with logical, rational hypotheses, which you then validate as an evaluator, but at least give you a notion that, poor households may be reluctant, given the impact of the 2016 crisis and the effects which we are now, looking at and analyzing of the pandemic, are reluctant to enhance, increase their consumption level because they are in survival strategy mode. And so my answer to Dege would be, that is a perfect example for me of why it's so important and how stakeholders can be invited and should be invited to participate in designing and then implementing the evaluation. Thank you.
But I just like to add one point of the issue involving stakeholders. What often happens, particularly if an international agency is helping finance and plan a program, the international agency often has a plan of the stakeholders that they would like to involve. And a typical example might be, for example, that the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Rural Development, maybe often they don't get on too well together, or that they don't coordinate very much. And so when an international agency comes and funds a project, they may put into the plan that there's going to be a planning committee for the project, which will involve these different ministries, the different stakeholders. And sometimes you find that the local partners don't agree with this. They don't necessarily want to be involved. So you can often find that in the planning meetings, all of the stakeholders are there. But if you look carefully, you may find that some of the agencies, it's only very junior people they send because they really don't agree with having to work together with some of these other agencies. So for an outsider may say the program's going very well, all of the stakeholders are there, but in fact, some of them may not really be in agreement with the project. So you have to look very carefully. And the other point which Raymond mentioned was who is not there. In some countries, I don't think this is necessarily the case in Mongolia, but in some countries, the governments don't like to work with some of the non-profits, the NGOs, because maybe they're criticizing the government. And so sometimes the government will say, we tried very hard to get the NGOs to attend, but they didn't come. And then you find they weren't actually invited. So you have to look deeper to understand the dynamics of who is there and who isn't. And sometimes, again, some agencies, they may feel uncomfortable. They don't have the technical expertise. And so they feel if the Ministry of Statistics is talking all about these technical analysis, another agency might feel uncomfortable. And so they don't come to the meetings because they don't understand some of the approaches. So you really have to look carefully to understand the role of the stakeholders, who is actually running the program and who is reluctant to be involved.
Michael, I have a question. It seems like because it's a not linear process and that has a lot of intended, unintended other factors, economic, environment, etc., right? Currently we are working on one final evaluation of World Bank, and then we are designing the evaluation design, like what kind of method we would apply. And the more I get familiarized with all the project documents and the context the project is operated. It seems like I'm thinking to apply realist evaluation method, which uses context, mechanism, and outcome configuration, because it has assumption that the intervention can differ depending on different contexts and depending on different audiences, etc. So do you think a realist evaluation using CMO configuration could be one of the complex evaluation method? I know you will be talking about method in the coming sessions, so just want a quick answer, like reference check if I'm going on the right direction.
I think the realist evaluation is a very useful framework, and for the reasons you were mentioning. But one of the interesting things is that it focuses on the fact that the beneficiaries, a lot of the different stakeholders, change the way the program operates, because a lot of evaluations assume that the program is designed by a particular ministry, and it will be that the beneficiaries are just passive recipients. They just receive the services. But in fact, if you look at programs, the programs we were talking about emergence, the programs often change because of the reaction of the beneficiaries. That if they don't like a program, they may change the way it works. It may work differently in different contexts. And there was just one quick example was a school feeding program I was working on in Central America, in Nicaragua. And the program was intended just to provide school meals for the students who were in the school. But the mothers used to come and bring the siblings, the other children, along with them when they took their child to school. And so some of the schools started to offer the breakfast to the siblings as well, who weren't students, but they came along as well. And so because of the attitude of the parents, in some cases, the program became completely different. Instead of just providing meals for 20 students, in some cases, the local farmer said, well, we will give some food so you can provide this for more children. Some of the fathers said, well, we will go and put in the electricity so you can cook the meals. And so in some cases, because of the pressures from the beneficiaries, the program completely changed. So you could find in one community, it was still just, the teacher said, no, this is a sibling, she doesn't get to eat, it's only the 20 children. In another, it was a completely different program where there were, in some cases, all of the young children in the community came along and they got a meal, not because of the design by the implementing agency. Often they were very unhappy with this because it affected their budget, but because of the interactions between the beneficiaries and the agencies designing. So this is one of the interesting things with the realist evaluation, is just giving more attention to the role of the beneficiaries. And often the implementing agency doesn't even realize this is happening, because when they visit their office, everything is going according to the official plan. But when they're not there, often it's working quite differently because of these kinds of dynamics. So understanding that is very important. But I think realist evaluation is a very useful approach, and we'll discuss that more later. Before we finish, I would just like to have just 1 minute, if I could comment on Amara's presentation. Just 1 minute. I thought this was a very interesting example of how complexity comes into thinking about a program. And you can see in terms of the implementation of the project, some of the complex issues were things like the problems of actually measuring the poverty in the community, political pressures to change try to cut out some of the beneficiaries to save money. So you can see how complexity worked at the level of the project. It worked at the level of the organization because of problems of coordination between a number of different agencies of implementing these programs. There was a very good discussion of the external environment, how this was affecting the program, the changes in the international context, the effects of COVID and so on. And also it was mentioned a little bit, the processes of change, that you may find that a lot of these programs had a short-term benefit, but maybe if you went back after 1 year or 2 years, you would find that some of these benefits hadn't continued, or what sometimes happens is poor people gradually drop out of programs over time. And you couldn't, if you go back 2 years later, sometimes you find that it's more the slightly better off people who are benefiting. So I think the presentation was a very good framework for thinking about how complexity can be built into your evaluation. So thank you to Amara for a very interesting presentation.
Dr. Bamberger, we're gonna take the very last question from Dr. Isaac Michael, who raised a hand before the very first session. So he asked that, how do we treat impact indicators in the program or project design in the complexity phenomenon that you are presenting?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's an important question. So as I mentioned with the previous question, the 5-step complexity evaluation framework, steps 2 and 3, when you're looking at the individual project components, this is very similar to a traditional impact evaluation. So you look at all of the impacts of each of the different components in a very similar way that you would do in a conventional evaluation. The difference is that you then go on to steps 4 and 5, where you ask, if the program was working in isolation, maybe it has certain kinds of impacts. But when you look at the environment, the effects of COVID, the changing international situation, and so on, you may find that the complex outcomes are quite different. So we build on the traditional impact evaluation, which is very, very important, but we go beyond that to look at how coordination between different government agencies affects the sustainability of the program, how changes in the political environment, the cultural environment, how these are all influence. So the goal is to try to not come up with a completely new methodology that nobody understands, but to build upon all of the tools that we're familiar with evaluation, and then go beyond that to look at these much broader contexts. So we can end up asking, how does this program contribute to the SDGs? Maybe a great program affecting a small number of people, but when you try to see what the broader impacts are, it may not have many broader impacts, or they may be quite different because of the political pressures and so on. So we're trying to use all of the tools which people are familiar with and build on those, rather than saying you have to throw all of these away and start with some tools that you're not familiar with. So that's the goal.
Thank you, Dr. Bamberger. So let's just move on to the very last section of today's lessons learning session. So the Dr. Raymond Gervais is gonna just conclude the key lessons from today's seminar.
Okay,
So,
well, I didn't offer any written, but I shall read what I wrote, and then I'll make that available, both the speaking notes for the presentation I did earlier, and then these key issues, the key lessons. The reason I didn't put it in the presentation is that I was hoping that there would be discussion, and there has been quite interesting discussions, which I will put in the final key lessons. Okay, now, although most projects or even program evaluators are asked to analyze, they're still very much linear, if not in their design and implementation, at least in the questions managers identify in their requests for proposal. But then the trend is towards very inherently complex programs or goals-oriented statements, such as the SDGs. And that, I think, is an important element that we have to think, is that if, complexity-focused evaluations may not be relevant or less relevant at this point in time, we know for a fact the trend is for large international statements, large programs to be set up to address important, climate change, environmental issues, gender relationships. All of this we can see coming and rising through the SDGs and through all of the international platforms that have flourished in the last 40 years. The recent years of pandemic in all countries, including Mongolia, have underlined how what was viewed as well adapted in normal conditions, in brackets, then was put to the test, so that complexity emerged from the needs of adjusting seasoned projects and programs in all sectors. And that has a repercussion on evaluation processes, so that what we thought was, linear or seasoned or normal, or what managers sees as being, well, this is what we've been doing. In effect, if you drill deeper in your analysis, you discover that there is complexity rising from these changes. Complexity appears as a combination of internal characteristics, the workings of the program and its dynamics, the capacity to change, as well as external context factors affecting its design, implementation, and therefore evaluation. In trying to address complexity, a set of new concepts had to be devised, which must then be tested through the assessment of these elements' level of complexity. And this is the role of the checklist that we looked at and that we'll be using in upcoming sessions. The same can be said about the 5-step approach, which Michael very quickly looked at. And our objective in next sessions would be to apply that to the Mongolian context, so that the 5-step approach would be part of our discussion in next sessions. And then we talked about Mongolia. Mongolia was identified as a good example through both looking on the one hand at the complexity of change processes in 4 core sectors, from the micro level of communities to the world context in which the country and its poverty reduction programs evolved. On the other hand, as Amara's analysis pointed us to, on the other hand, a simulation-based study of how households, the micro level, overcame the trial of a world pandemic, and that's at the macro level, and how government policies have tried to mitigate the effects. And just a final note, which is striking, I was looking while Amara was doing the presentation, I was looking at her graphs, and one graph, which is really quite telling, is the fact, and there you have an example of how a government, the flexibility of a government became central to trying to mitigate the negative effects of an international event, the fall of cashmere prices at the international market, and the pandemic for herders. That support to herders was part and parcel, was added as a part and parcel of mitigating scheme in Mongolia because of these 2 factors. And so that shows to what extent the government of Mongolia really showed flexibility, showed a capacity to adjust to conditions. And that's really striking, because the herder support, if you look at the data, is far superior to what a seasoned normal component of that scheme, which is the food stamp program, exceeded the food stamp program by a great multiplier. So there you have a perfect example of, if we were to do an evaluation of mitigating poverty mitigating schemes in Mongolia, we would have to take into account all of these factors, because they all contributed to changing to changing what was being done and how it was being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond, for effectively summing up our today's learning session. So this is the end part of our today's session. So before ending our session, I wanted to announce the two things. First one is our next learning session with the Dr. Bamberger is on June 8th. So the second session is going to be on the topic of a more detailed presentation of the 5-step complexity evaluation model, which he presented on today's lesson, and the application to gender-based violence. So this is going to be more specific and detailed session, which is going to detail out all the 5-step complexity model that we learned today. And second announcement is I just sent through the chat the checklist for the assessment. So please, we are inviting all the participants to review, if possible, to practice this complexity checklist before the second session on June 8th. So these are the two announcements. So finally, thank you for all those presenters, today's presenters and speakers, Dr. Bamberger, Michael Bamberger, and also Dr. Raymond Gervais, and also Ms. Professor Amartuvshin Tserennadmid, and also all participants who took the time to participate on today's learning session. So see you on the next learning session.
Thank you very much. See you.
Bye. Have a good night and have a good day.
Thank you.